Hello, and welcome to Sacred Herbalism, the full moon segment of the Elder Tree podcast, where we explore how plants and fungi can support us to enter into a sacred relationship with life and the living world. I'm your host, Stephanie Hazel, herbalist, anthropologist, and a deep lover of this wild world. Let's walk into the moonlit forest together, into a world of magic, mysticism, psychedelic teachers, and, of course, the plants themselves. Are you ready? Hello, dear listeners. Happy full moon in Gemini. Welcome to this month's episode. Funny story, I just checked online what the full moon was going to be before recording this, and I just put into Google next full moon, December 2025, and their AI assistant told me that it was Capricorn. I was about to run with that. I thought, no, I'll just check. And then when I actually looked at websites, AI was completely making it up. And it is indeed in Gemini. So happy full moon in Gemini, an excellent sign for this month's interview, which is a very analytical and abstract thinking and intellectual sign. And this month, I'm talking all about science, in defense of science, with Dr. Kaja Skraskova. So Dr. Kaja Skraskova is a wonderful woman. She lives in Brisbane. She is a herbalist and a pharmacist and a researcher. She has a PhD in analytical chemistry, and she specialises in making topical herbal medicines, so medicines for application on the skin. She has a small business called Herbae Thylacini, and it's an award-winning herbal skincare range. And she also teaches herbalists and herbal folk the fine art of Galenic preparations for topical applications. So you can check out one of her courses on the website in the show notes. As I said, we're talking about science, and Kaja is very passionate about this topic. We discuss the many faces of science: science as a method of learning, science as a joy of discovery, science as a form of academia and academic research, and science as a political weapon. Kaja urges us as herbalists to get better at science and to be careful of using science when it serves us and then brushing it off when it doesn't. I don't know, have you been guilty of that? I reckon I probably have. Kaja argues that science is not to blame for the problems of the world, and that we should not confuse science with the global political greed agenda that has seemingly co-opted scientific research in order to justify its own methods. I think this is a great conversation to be having on this segment, the Sacred Herbalism segment, because a lot of my discussions are not directly anti-science, but you could see them in that way. There's a lot of critique of science and pointing at the limitations and the problems with the scientific establishment and how that has impacted our ways of understanding truth and the ways of engaging with the living world, further our own interests. And so I think it's a really great balancer to this long-form conversation that we're having about the nature of the sacred and the mystical inside the art of herbal medicine, to have someone who is passionately advocating for the beauty of science and the importance of science. So I hope you really get something out of this episode, and please write to me and tell me what you think. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on this as herbalists and herbal folk of Australia and the world. Welcome to the Elder Tree podcast. Kaja, it's lovely to have you back. I know that 2 years ago you were interviewed by Twiggy, and this time we're going to talk a bit about sacred herbalism together. Welcome.
Thank you for having me back. I'm a big fan of the Elder Tree podcast, and it's a great honor to be invited again. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. I'd love if you could introduce yourself and your background just briefly. I know that you went quite deeply into this story in the last episode. So anyone who's interested, there's the link to the previous episode in the show notes and you can listen to Kaja. But please just give us a little rundown about who you are, the work you do, and your journey to this place.
I always tell the story in the same way, and it's almost it's so embedded in my brain in the same way. But essentially, I'm from the Czech Republic, where I studied pharmacy, and what inspired me to study pharmacy in the first place was my love of medicinal plants, which is a little bit counterintuitive because in Australia, herbal medicine is not part of pharmaceutical degree, unlike in the Czech Republic. And when I finished my degree, I was kind of lured into science and chemistry, so embarked on a scientific journey. And then midway through my PhD degree, I came to visit Tasmania. And that kind of brought me full circle back to herbal medicine. I was very keen to study native Tasmanian plants and was enchanted by the local flora. And yeah, it kind of like brought me back onto the herbal path. And then in 2016, I moved with my partner to Tasmania. I was working on a short research project researching the native Tasmanian plants and their chemistry and their medicinal properties. And in the same year, I founded a small business called Herbae Thylacini, which is active to this date. And it started like I would say like a small research endeavor. And over the years, I kind of started making herbal medicine. I was always focusing on making the medicine from native plants. It's something I have been very interested, especially at the beginning. And the focus of the medicine was always topical medicine, so herbal medicine for the skin, always topical application of herbs. And in a recent year, maybe the last 18 months, I've started teaching on this topic, so how to make herbal medicine with specification for topical application.
It's interesting as well that that passion for native plants is there, because in my research in anthropology, looking at a lot of indigenous plants and plant use, there is a really strong tradition in Australian herbalism, in Aboriginal herbalism, of using herbs not internally but topically, smoking oils, steam baths, bathing. So there's a beautiful synergy there.
Yeah, that's true. There is obviously not that much, written knowledge of the medicinal use of native Australian plants, but few of the books that exist, almost every plant, and I'm exaggerating now a little bit, but so many plants have documented topical use. And obviously, like for us, it's very difficult to understand the nuances of how that plant was being used for each topical case. But yeah, a lot of them, there will be a lot of references to plants being crushed and applied on the skin in a form of a poultice, I suppose, or being turned into paste, or as you mentioned, the smoke medicine as well. So yeah, a lot of native plants have this beautiful reference back to the skin. And I would also think that that because the First Nations of Australia were dealing with a lot of skin issues, a lot of like injuries that would be tying back to the musculoskeletal system. So I would assume that a lot of the applications of the medicine that they were seeking was actually topical, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe the inner systems are less dysregulated by a healthier lifestyle.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. And then,
Mm.
like all the different injuries and that would happen inadvertently from being outside and coming into contact, with, I don't know, sharp branches and just literally walking and working outside um, needed to be, treated way more often than, I don't know, heart attack.
I mean, you see that even in the old European herbals, that there's such like a preeminence of the vulnerary plants and the ones that are used for topical for injuries and even arthritis and wounds, and like the calendulas and the yarrows and all of these kind of the plantains that are much less common and treasured in modern herbal practice, because the reality is we just don't injure ourselves as much because we're just sitting at a computer.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And
Mm.
I have over the years, I'm sure there is way more, but I literally work with like tens of different plants just for the topical application. There is like so many different plants, and our mind often circles back to calendula, which is like like the hallmark of vulnerary herb or skin herb. But there are just so many others, and I like getting adventurous with it.
Yeah, I'm only just starting to open that door in my heart of the different topical applications of plants. So it's
or
exciting.
even just or even just like that for when we are talking topical application, it doesn't necessarily have to be the skin. Like you can
Mm,
target other um, organ systems or organs via topical application. I've already mentioned the musculoskeletal system, but you can target the nervous system via topical application of nervine herbs, for example, especially those that are aromatic. So it's it doesn't have to be necessarily just the skin. It can be bruises and
mm,
sprained ankles and anything. And I like that it's so versatile, even though on the first glance it might not be so.
mm. I was actually just doing a bit of reading on Ayurvedic preparations for topical use oils, Tyler's medicated oils, and they make them a bit differently than we would in in the West, but they have such a strong tradition for vata constitutions of using medicated oils on the skin to regulate the nervous system.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I feel like I can go on a big tangent here, how really important just how the skin medicine feels on the skin, how that automatically ties into its medicinal value, that it's
Mm.
not just about the, say, herbal components of it, but also just whether the or skin being our primary uh, sensory organ for touch. We can tell whether the product spreads well or whether it glides, whether it's
Mm.
rough, whether it stings, whether it signalizes some kind of a danger or inconvenience in the product, or whether the product feels heavy on the skin or light or fluffy, slimy, whether it moves. So yeah, there's just so many sensorial appreciations that we perceive through the skin as we are applying topical herbal medicine on it, that are also not often thought about. Like I feel like a lot of herbalists would be thinking about the herbs, but I always like to talk about all the other aspects of the herbal medicine that
Mm.
is not the herbs, and then obviously uniting all of them together.
I mean, of course, every medium that we use in our medicine making has its own energetics, and if we're using tinctures, it's going to be dispersing, heating, and drying, and it's going to enhance those aspects of the plant. And if we're using oils, it's going to be, heavy and unctuous and slippery and moist, and that's going to enhance that application of the plant. But I love what you're saying. I teach a lot, as you would know, a lot about the embodied capacity to feel what the herbs are, what the medicine that they carry is, through the body, through the taste, through the smell. But rubbing any herb you have, if you like crush it up and rub it on your skin, it's going to be another input that you can absolutely learn about that herb's properties. And that's even rubbing the tincture on your skin would tell you something, right? Looking at the way that it moves and feeling it, and does it tingle, as you said? Does it burn? Does it soothe? I had some
Absolutely.
great.
Is it slimy? Does it spread well? Is it oily? Yeah, it's like so many different
Mm.
sensory feelings.
Totally. Someone told me once, I think it might have been Koa Windsong actually. He's also been interviewed on this podcast, and he's a real bush tucker kind of guy. And he was saying that if you're ever in doubt, and especially if you're lost or something like that, always rub something on your skin first and wait a few hours before you ever eat it, And that's just that basic thing of like, oh yeah, if you think, is this an edible fruit, is an edible leaf, before you eat some of it, rub it on your skin and just, watch what happens. The skin will tell you if it's not always right, but the skin is going to be a good indication. If something burns your skin, you definitely don't want to ingest it.
True. Uh, yeah, I would say very, very good general advice with probably some mm, minor exceptions. And just like first thing that came to my mind would be nettles. Like upon stinging myself with nettles, I probably would be very cautious of eating them if I didn't know they are nettles. But I get the point, of course.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't want to chew up some raw nettles and swallow them.
Yeah, probably not a great idea. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So we had a really great conversation earlier, and you are essentially a scientist who is working as a herbalist. And that's a really potent marrying of skill sets and interest sets. And in this podcast, we talked a lot about the dangers of science, the biases of science, the risks of a materialist worldview that sees the universe as, something mechanical and void of spirit. And I'd love to hear a bit about what science means to you.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for bringing it up. And I like to think about myself as being a born scientist. I've always been someone who likes to, ask questions, dissect how this works, how does it look like, what happens here. Like one of the reasons why I decided to pursue scientific science instead of keep working in a pharmacy was like I remember this distinct moment when I was preparing an ointment for someone, and kind of instead of thinking about the client, I was kind of imagining what is happening to the Vaseline as it's being melted under infrared heat, and like how the structure of it falls apart on the molecular level. And so I always had these like very in-depth questions. I wanted to understand how things work and why things are the way they are. And at the same time, I I've always admired experts who know their field really, really well, and at the same time they have a broad general knowledge from other fields. And that's also how I approach science, very I would say enthusiastically, wanting to know everything about everything. And I remember my PhD mentor was always kind of like teasing me for, oh yeah, Kaja, it's you want to always know too much. And that's, however, what always science meant to me. It was like combination of knowledge, interdisciplinary combination of what we know, tying it all together, building the big picture. And one of the reasons why I also eventually stepped out of academia was how incredibly narrow it can feel for individual working in an academia in terms of knowledge base. How a lot of people just get very deep into one topic, but if you kind of step 2 centimeters away from it to the left, they are immediately lost. And that's something that I kind of became a bit resentful about, I suppose, in academic environment. But yeah, science for me is a way of acquiring knowledge, way of being curious, way of tying things together and placing them in a context. And I appreciate that it might be a bit of a maybe unusual way of looking at science, because I would expect that a lot of scientists would tell you that science is about like being objective and to the point and very specialized and very exact, which is of course part of it. But for me, it was always science is a contextual way of looking at things, which is also maybe why I am a very strong advocate of science, because I often feel like I'm talking about something slightly different. When science is being criticized, I often feel like, but that's not what real science is. It's a little bit different. It's a little bit different for me.
Can you explain more about this idea of context? I don't think I've come across that in the discussion of science, and actually I think it's one of my critiques of science. The scientific method seeks to understand the details, and often in a very microscopic lens, and then we can lose the broader context, and there's danger in that. So tell me more about your understanding. What do you mean when you talk about science is about placing things in context?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And it's, again, one of the things that I came to really dislike about doing science in the academic environment, where you would, know something, you would know so much detail about tiny little thing. It's like looking in a house and knowing everything about one window and, like knowing how the light reflects and how you can freeze through it and the density of the glass and all of that, but completely losing the point of what the house looks like, right? Like what the house actually is. Is it a tiny cottage or is it a skyscraper? And that's something that I've always been very much against and very bewildered when I realized this is how academic science is often practiced. Never really like that. And like some of the scientists that I've come to admire and that are kind of like, I don't have a lot of idols, but like some of the people that come up over and over again in conversation with my husband are usually independent scientists who indeed were coming to their research from perhaps a different field and then tying it together. Like one that comes to mind is, for example, James Lovelock, who basically he was part engineer and part scientist, and he was, for example, he was the one who discovered the detrimental effects of halogens on the ozone layer. So very, very significant discovery. Yet he was also the one who formulated the Gaia theory. Yeah, and this is absolutely, you could almost say like these are like two completely different fields because they are. And it is absolutely exceptional for someone in science to be able to do that these days. Again, like putting things into a broader context, being able to pull information from different fields together.
Uh, I think it's an interesting point of like that science is richer when there's a broader scope of understanding. Absolutely. And I read a study, and I won't be able to quote it because I just remember what I read, but I don't remember the actual details. A few years ago, where they were saying that innovation, and they were looking a lot at engineering, that to solve really hard problems, you have better success taking people from a completely different field. And they were looking at some problems around bridges, and I think they brought pharmaceutical researcher or someone completely left field from engineering, and they were able to come up with workable solutions that were completely new because they weren't stuck into the established way of doing things where you can no longer see what opportunities are there, and you can't bring a beginner's mind anymore. And so I thought that sounds like it kind of relates what you're saying about the amazing James Lovelock, who I also respect and admire a lot.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And then another kind of like a hero of ours that come up in our talks with my partner often is Edwin Land, who was the inventor of Polaroid. So he invented instant photography, and one of his many quotes, um, or one that I remember and I often put out there, he said, "If you want to know something, don't ask an expert because they will tell you it's impossible." Or if you want to do something, don't ask an expert because they will tell you it's impossible. And he actually invented the Polaroid machine because his daughter asked him once, he was taking a photograph of her and she was asking him, why can't I have the photograph right now? And he thought, well, that's actually a very good question. Why not? And then he spent the next 20 years literally working on the science, if you like, of developing the photograph instantly. And it was not because he was a special optometrist. Like he again was combining knowledge from so many different fields to come up with the solution. Yet if you would come to someone who was developing films at the time, they would, an expert who would know everything about film development, they would tell you that's completely impossible to do that. And if listeners are interested, his biography is aptly called "Insisting on the Impossible." It's a fantastic book, and yeah, if you're so inclined, recommend looking into it.
Yeah, I feel like I want to read that. And so I think what you're pointing to there, I'm hearing in you a love of problem solving and a love of like innovation, and that kind of passionate dedication towards solving one problem. As you said, he just spent his whole life trying to solve this one question that I'm sure all of us have like 10 of those questions that we could be working towards, but we don't all do that. And that in a way is the heart of like, shall we say, the inspiring scientist who just is like, I'm going to work this out. I'm hearing a love of of that magic in you.
Yeah, this is probably it. Like my partner is so much more into like innovative solutions. I have been always more on the side of like how things work. Like it's almost like you have science, and you could split it into two directions. One that is asking how things are, and the other one asking like what can we do with it. And he is definitely, out of the two of us, the one who is way more interested in how you apply all of that
Mm-hmm.
knowledge. Whereas for me, it's kind of enough just to understand and know. And then again, like obviously we can be going here on like whether on another tangent, thinking whether or talking about whether like is it necessary to know so much about everything, and is it a certain point where it actually becomes harmful? Um, Again, like all the scientific progress and all the information that we have had, and look where the world is. I hear that often as a kind of counter argument against science, and I often like to think there that it's not sort of like the science itself that is problematic, but it's really like we have access to this knowledge. Now, what are we going to be doing with it? We have access to this amazing knowledge of radioactivity. So what are we going to do with that? Are we going to develop an atomic bomb, or are we going to develop some tools that can be used in medicine, for example? So it just comes down to intention, like whether they want to do something for the good of everyone or whether they want to do good for themselves.
I mean, the day that our cleverness outstripped our wisdom was a problem.
Yeah,
And
I've
hasn't it
I've heard
just?
I have heard somewhere quite an apt statement saying that humans are the most intellectual species, but by far not the most intelligent.
Mm. Yeah. We're very clever. We're good at working things out and making things happen. I mean, I think like that question there of like, is it dangerous to know too much? Obviously, that's a question that people have been grappling with for thousands of years because it's kind of the opening of the Bible, right? It's like the Adam and Eve story of Eve eating of the fruit of, from the tree of knowledge, and then that being a problem, right? And so I think that's obviously something we've been wrestling with as a species on a philosophical level for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. Or like another book book that comes to mind is Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who wrote Faust, who basically was a character who signed a contract with the devil in exchange for knowing everything.
Mm.
And I've been actually often thinking, like, what would I do? Would I? Because it's definitely interesting. Like, how much should we know? Yeah.
Mm. So I think that, when we're speaking about science, for me, what science is, and this I think is an important distinction, is that there's the science as a method of inquiry and study. And I think that's how science originated. It was a process and a method for trying to understand, coming up with a hypothesis, testing the hypothesis, using data rather than superstition or emotion at the time, and trying to understand how can we apply our rational mind to a logical process to deepen knowledge with clarity. And I think as a method of inquiry, it's very powerful and it's wonderful. I think it's excellent to be able to do that and to apply intellectual rigor to problems and to ideas that we have. I don't think that should be the only method of inquiry, and I think that's part of the problem, that we've put it on a pedestal as the only way to know truth. And I think there are other ways that need to be woven together. But I think for me the biggest problem is I have an issue with science with a capital S. Science as a as an abstract, almost godlike figure that is not the method of inquiry that I see in the newspaper, science tells us, da, da, da. I'm like, who the hell is science? It's almost like, the church says, and we stopped doing that, and then we just couldn't bear to be without this like abstract figure of authority. And so we put a capital S on science and there we go, right? And that's what I have an issue with. There's lots of problems inside the method of inquiry of science, but there's a bigger problem of science as an entity that knows and has authority over everything else.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, I suppose I've conveyed my enthusiasm for science, and as you have very nicely summarized it. And then there is also lots of problems I have with science. I am on the same page as you with what you have just said. Like, science kind of developed as a counterpower to church, actually, at the beginning. Like, when you had church as the carrier of the knowledge or the truth, as you said, and people were just directed to believe, have faith. This is what church says, so that's how it is. And then it was at the sort of the break of the centuries of the I think it was 15th and 16th century, where Martin Luther came with the Reformation of the church, and he was kind of pointing to, well, this is kind of getting out of hand here. And kind of, I feel like we are living a parallel here, where also science kind of became, because then after what came after his Reformation was like kind of, there was Renaissance, right? And it was this emphasis on individuality and emphasis on having lots of interests and opening up and having your own inquiry and asking your own questions and getting your own answers. That kind of, and that's, I would say that that's a good thing, right? Like expanding your mind and probing for yourself. But that, again, we kind of swung the pendulum, far to whatever, right or left, and it's just too much. And we are kind of like living through the parallel where a lot of people would be criticizing science with exactly the, almost like word for word, verbatim, for what Luther was criticizing about church 500 years ago. It's like science that is too much, is holding too much power, is trying to provide answer to everything and holding the truth. However, also having said that, like, science, again, in its like proper definition, science doesn't provide us with truth, and it doesn't provide us with proof of anything either. It shows us evidence, not proof and not truth. Science can never show us the truth, which is also perhaps often misinterpreted. I mean, definitely the media play a big role here, and I also feel like that this science with a big S, as you are talking about it, has been kind of politicized and capitalized. Like, there is obviously like so much emphasis on science in capitalism because it's good for the cash. So I definitely have a lot of problems with science as such as well.
Not just an emphasis on capitalism, but I think that it's also been co-opted by the markets, because of the nature of funding of scientific research. I think it'd be very different if we had a non-biased like government body that was like, we fund the research in the country, and I mean, of course, there'd be lobbyists and it would still be biased in some way, but the fact that generally, especially medical research, is happening funded by pharmaceutical companies, that really changes uh, the outcome, because we know from physics that a researcher being in the room and having an expectation will change how a subatomic particle moves, right? Like, it's much less cut and dry than we like to believe. And so then the way that studies are shaped has a huge impact on the result and on the quote unquote evidence.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, science in sort of like its pure form would be, objective. And I think that's also often the argument that is being put forth by scientists, like, well, science is the only objective way of having or acquiring knowledge. But of course, there are biases that exist in science, and, like confirmation bias when you're only looking for confirming what you already kind of think is going to happen, or selection bias when you are selecting a population of samples improperly, like you're selecting only certain people for your study, for example, and not looking more broadly.
Mm.
So yeah, science is definitely full of biases. It's not as objective as we would like it to be. Yeah, I actually had another line that I wanted to say, but it just fell out of my brain right now.
Before, you were talking about context, and I think I want to return to that because um, you were pointing to finding it very difficult working in science, the siloization. So basically, that people end up working. You have a liver specialist who doesn't ever talk to the kidney specialist, and when you come in with a liver disease, they never look at your kidneys or your bones. And this in medical research, especially, I think in this podcast, people are interested in health. It just seems so ludicrous that you can spend 30 years studying the liver and have no idea how the nervous system works, right? and that you might have a liver disease and then also have chronic UTIs and also have rheumatoid arthritis, and you're talking to 3 different people about those problems, and no one's ever trying to say like, how do they join together? And I think in medical science, that's just seems ridiculous to me, and that's an example of that extreme siloization and a loss of context and
Yeah.
relationality.
Yeah, I agree. Like, I think the loss of context is a huge problem in science in general. Like, I can see how this is happening and why is this happening. It's again because we know so much. Like we know so much detail that is basically, like if you uh, look 500 or 400 years ago, like Leonardo da Vinci, right, who was like spread across everything. He was an artist, and he knew about anatomy and all of astronomy and all of that. And like these days, like we have such an in-depth knowledge about so many things that it's kind of impossible to contain all of that. But I can see how that happens, but it's obviously not a justification for that it should be happening. And of course, like bringing it back to the context of medical science, I agree that it's unjustifiable not having a broader context, not having a broader knowledge, not being able to put one and one together and connect things. Like I'm sure also, like not to be overtly critical, like I'm sure there are some amazing scientists who are very much able to do that, but it's certainly not the norm. And there are, as you have already touched upon, the funding of science, which obviously it's big problem of its own, like how it's being funded, how it's being presented, who has access to the information, paywalls behind published articles, or the other way around. How knowledge is then being distributed. So yeah, there is a lot of things that are being wrong. Like a lot of academics would be publishing papers just for the sake of publishing. Probably a lot of you have heard the famous publish or perish in academia, where basically, if you don't publish enough scientific papers, then you can no longer work in academia, which is a massive negative impact on the quality of science that is being out there.
Yeah, I didn't realize that was how it worked. Yeah, that is a difficult. And then there's also the issue of, we talk about evidence-based decisions, and every government says that they're making evidence-based health decisions and making evidence-based climate decisions. And I don't see that as being true. There's a lot of great evidence out there. If you just looked at the evidence that exists, especially if you were to filter out research that's been funded by an interested party, then there's so much amazing high quality research to support herbal medicine, diet, exercise over pharmaceutical use, over, like same with with ecosystemic health and the impacts even of like the environment people live in and their health and well-being. There's so much amazing research out there, and it doesn't seem like that actually translates into policy most of the time. And so
And
there's a co-opting of science by some of those big political desires, and every herbalist I think knows like there's so much data and research backing the use of herbs. Half of the studies I read, I'm like, if this was a drug it'd be everywhere.
yeah, you're absolutely right. And I have already been talking about that before, that science has been politicized and capitalized. Yeah, it's another name that I will drop in here is Jason Hickel. If you're not following him on social media yet, or if you haven't read his book, The Divide, do it. It's an absolutely essential read. He's one of the leader on basically explaining inequality in the current world. And I absolutely love his quote when he said that our current society has never been organized around science. It has been organized around capital. And it just sounds so right, because you're totally right. There is like so much science, like if we point the most obvious one, and that's climate science. I mean, climate scientists have been literally shouting, screaming at us, for decades about the impact of burning fossil fuels has on climate change. Yet, has that been translated into politics? Nope, because it's not it doesn't bring money, right? And the only science you will hear about, like all the technological developments that can kind of counterbalance climate change, are only mentioned if they actually can be capitalized on. And so I can see how a lot of people would be shunning science and saying science is bad. But for me, and maybe this is like some kind of subjective interpretation, but for me, this is not a problem of science itself. It's a problem of how science is being interpreted, how scientific knowledge is being put into practice and into use, who gets to benefit from it. And it's almost like like for me, it's like almost like two different things.
So you don't think that science is to be blamed for the state of the world?
No, I actually don't. Again, like it comes down to, you have all this knowledge. What are you going to do about it? What are you going to do with it? How are you going to apply it? We have amassed this amazing amount of knowledge. I mean, the most world problems could be solved tomorrow if the world was oriented not around, capital accumulation. And obviously, we are here getting into politics, which I'm perhaps not, not perhaps, I'm not, in a position to really talk about. But I mean, even just like if you look at how she says she's not. I just said I'm not going to be talking about politics yet. I'm about to bite into it. But like, if you look at how science is being shunned away, especially by the far right politicians, that who kind of like, to me, it almost seems like, like a lot of people criticize science. Oh yeah, how can we win them over? Oh yeah, let's criticize science too. Let's take away credibility from the expert scientists who have been working on a certain topic for decades. Let's just take that away, because a lot of people will listen to us, because that's populism, right? It's what people want to hear. And so you can see like a lot of criticism of science, which a lot of it, as we have already covered in our conversation, is warranted. And then there is a lot of criticism of science, which is pure populism and pure, pointing more towards more power gain and capital gain. So yeah, I think it's hard for me to answer it eloquently, and I'm sorry if I'm kind of waffling too much here, but I've been asking and thinking about this question for the past maybe 3 years really intensely, yet I can't eloquently answer the question, has science or is science responsible for the state of our society? But I always come back to no, in its pristine form, it's not. It's most about how it's being used and abused almost.
I hadn't thought of that before about, some of the extreme right using a large section of the population's wariness of science, and maybe science fatigue, science being used to bash us all over the head and tell us what we should and shouldn't do, um, But that's a really interesting point, whether or not they agree, critiquing science as a way to get some of the more alternative groups of people on board with more right-wing agendas is a very interesting strategy. Yeah.
I
I
mean,
think
it's like, why do it's like, it's just, it took me a little while before this clicked. Like how come so many like health oriented people in the United States, voted in the presidential elections the way they did? It's like, well, hang on a minute. What's just happened here? And I think this is like one of the common denominators that actually swung them over to the, you know, devil's side.
so. You said before something about that the science that we see that's promoted, that's popularized, is usually science that is around solving technological problems of something that can be marketed, right? And then I think what we get there is a science of gadgetry rather than a science of life. Because we think we need to make some big changes in the way that humans as our species are engaging with our lives, what we pursue, how we live. But there's a really dangerous narrative that you're pointing to there that is kind of like, oh, well, science will save us. And you're saying that science could already save us. We already know the things, but probably the changes we need to make are hard changes, right? But this idea that, oh, well, we're just going to move to Mars, or scientists will come up with this amazing machine that sucks carbon out of the atmosphere, or we're going to upload our brains to blah, blah. And it's a really pernicious narrative, and you've helped me understand why I don't like it so much, because there are lots of really great answers to the problems that we have that already exist inside many spheres, not just the scientific world, but they already exist in the scientific world. But yet we're kind of being primed to spend lots of money on things we don't need to make us be able to keep chasing gratification, distraction, and comfort, while putting more of our money and funds into gadgets that make someone very rich.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you beautifully nailed it. But yeah, it's like one of the first things, like we have this little post office around the corner here. And every time I go there, it's like full of just, excuse my language, but it's just full of shit, like there's like so many plastic toys and just like garbage. Always thinking like, wow, like I think we can, solve half of our problems just by putting a ban on manufacturing these things in the first place. And then, if you're on social media, like you often get these like advertisements for the new things that's gonna improve your health or improve this or solve that. And you're like, wow, like I don't need any more stuff. Like we really don't need more stuff, in no more in more inventions. We just need to completely like refocus our where we put our efforts. And it's definitely not into inventing more gadgets. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And maybe to round this, like I also want to point out that as much as I'm like talking positively about science here, I am also not an extremist in the sense that I think it is the only way or that it's the only path. I am very much for finding a balance in how we acquire knowledge, very much for introducing other modalities. And while obviously science is, maybe there's like another sort of like problem that a lot of us feel about science is that it has been stressed so much that there has been not enough emphasis on other ways of how we get to know the world around us by pure perception or by like perceiving our emotions or intuition and all of that. And I think it's all part of it should work together, like there shouldn't be too much emphasis on science, but at the same time I'm kind of like saying, yeah, but be careful not to make the mistake of again swinging completely to the other side of swinging the pendulum completely to the other side by completely abandoning and rejecting science, because that's also not the way. It's like I like the metaphor of like if you break your leg and you will have it in a cast for 6 weeks, but then the cast comes off, your muscles will have degraded, right, and your leg will look much weaker, whereas the leg that you've been using all these 6 weeks will be strong. And that's kind of current science, right? Science is very strong, but in order to balance your legs, well, you have to practice and you have to exercise the leg that is weaker. It's very, very silly trying to achieve the balance by, well, how about putting the other leg in the cast now so that we are equally weak on both sides? It just doesn't make any sense. So I think while we should try to put more emphasis on indigenous ways of acquiring knowledge, indigenous ways of seeing the world, leaning more into our emotions, our intuition, we should not completely reject all the knowledge that we have acquired via scientific investigation.
Thank you for that point, because definitely the reason why I, in my courses, have such a strong emphasis on embodied and intuitive knowledge is not because I think that intellectual and scientific knowledge is wrong or bad, but because it's overdeveloped. And so most of us need to practice those other skills, but that all three of them need to come together in order to really create wisdom. And I think that's what we're missing in our culture. We are very clever and we're lacking in wisdom. And so we have to be able to bring and synthesize those different worlds together. But I do love the image that you've given me there of putting the other leg in the cast. And I think I have been guilty of that at times, of being like, well, screw science. I don't want anything to do with it. And so I'm curious, right? Like, I think in a lot of herbalism, people kind of are going two ways. One is really like, we have to go evidence-based. We need to, only use references from scientific studies about plants, looking at rats being tested on with this single constituent. There's that direction that's gone really strong in Australia, definitely in the last 20 years in naturopathy. And then there's the other swing, which is more probably a lot of the listeners here, which is a lot more well, we're just going to practice plant listening and talking to plant spirits, and this very magical and mystical herbalism that's very intuitive and kind of puts the science leg in a cast. So I'm curious, do you think that herbalists need science?
From what I have just said, I think it's evident we should not reject it from our lives as herbalists specifically. And for another kind of reason that in support of science that comes to my mind is that as a herbalist, you will inadvertently bump into different articles and interpretation of scientific work that you will need to be able to interpret. You will need to be able to kind of get your head around them. And now this is actually incredibly difficult. Like, even for someone like myself who actually comes from the scientific background, like, I'm in no way able to interpret every single scientific study that is out there. I feel comfortable in my own field, but like, if you throw at me, like, so I did PhD in analytical chemistry, if you throw something at me from that field, I'll be able to assess these articles well. But if you throw at me something from molecular biology, I'll be able to understand the article, but I will not be able to, like, in detail tell you whether that science holds up or not. So it's I appreciate that it you can't interpret every single study that is out there. However, we should have the capacity, at least to some degree, to get oriented in scientific literature, if only for like scientific literacy, being able to distinguish what is nonsense from what actually holds up. I think this is incredibly important, and it kind of is part of what I was talking about before, the rejection of science. We still need it. It's around us. That knowledge is not going anywhere. It's around us. We have it, and we need to be able to find our way through it, so that we are not gullible by influencer who is a influencer who is sharing something on Instagram, and us
saying that viruses don't exist.
Yeah, for example, right? Or like, I often also see that herbalists. Sorry, I don't want to be like offending anyone here, but like, what I've seen often is like science being invited only when it fits the narrative. Like, for example, as a herbalist, you would be working with lemon balm and working with it in a way that it's a nervine herb and works for, it's great for anxiety, calming the nerves, etc., etc. And then herbalists would be very happy to dish out scientific research that supports that. And out of a sudden, oh yeah, science is great because look, science confirms that. But then when scientific research points out something that they don't agree with, it's out of a sudden, it's kind of like not right and science is bad. So I've definitely noticed this kind of phenomenon where we tend to invite science, or some of us tend to invite science in only when it supports our narrative. And I think that's also very dangerous.
Definitely guilty of that. I can see that. Yeah, I try, in my classes, I try to look at the scientific research and be like, all these things I agree with, and this one I find really confusing, and just try to put it on the table as like, can we try and make sense of that? But it's tricky. I'm going to share my challenge with that, and then I'd love to hear any advice you have for how herbalists like me can engage with science in a kind of balanced way. Because what's tricky for me is I don't feel like the people who are designing studies in herbs have a depth of wisdom in herbal medicine and specificity and complexity that exists in herbal medicine as very distinct from pharmaceutical medicine. And I would be designing studies that were, one, only using humans, because we know that herbs are safe because we've been using them for a long time. We don't need to torture animals, to understand herbal medicine. Working with humans, working with specific groups, looking at breaking people up by constitution, breaking people up by like gender and age, and understanding that different herbs will work differently for different kinds of people. And I feel like it muddies the waters if you have a really broad spectrum of people. Um, so I have these issues with the way scientific research is done. And also, so I did, my studies of herbal medicine, did a lot of science, but it wasn't very high level science. I finished my herbal medicine studies feeling like we did mainly science, but kind of shit science, which is really disappointing. And where would I go to develop the kind of scientific literacy that would enable me to read studies and be able to say, yes, this is a well-designed study. Yes, I think this is relevant to my practice, and to trust it enough for it to change the way that I understand that plant or that illness? How do I do that? How do I develop that scientific literacy?
Yeah, it's a great question. Like from my understanding of how sort of like science is being taught at Australian universities to naturopath and herbalist students is often narrowed down to clinical studies, right? Like it's almost like doing science in herbalism means doing clinical studies, but it's like so much more than that, right? Like even just like, for example, analyzing different chemical constituents in a plant and then understanding how to best extract them, for example, for one, yeah, understanding molecular signatures, or even just like photosynthesis, right? That also came from scientific
Mm.
investigation, understanding that. So one probably thing that I want to point out is like science is so much more than just clinical studies. My area of expertise are not clinical studies, and I am not able to like 100% perfectly estimate whether a study was designed perfectly well or
Mm.
not. So I appreciate that it is difficult for someone who doesn't have an expertise. I think one advice that I would have, if you want to lean into science and scientific investigation of a plant, like you beautifully teach in your Plant Allies and in all of your courses, how important it is to spend time with the herb, how important it is to really know it in an embodied way, sit with it. I have done your beautiful Plant Allies course, and we have spent 1 week examining one or sitting with one herb. And even that 1 week felt like not enough time. Like a lot of us actually left after that week thinking like, wow, I'm just so much more curious about this herb now. I would like to do a month on it. And I think when leaning into your own scientific investigation of a particular herb, for example, take the time to find articles across different fields, from different journals by different authors, examining the herb from different angles, because it's not enough to make a tea out of lemon balm and know everything about it and feel like, yeah, I'm now expert on lemon balm because I was drinking lemon balm for two days. And the same way, if you find one study on lemon balm, that's just not enough. You have to find 10, find 20, find 30 of them and read them and analyze them and summarize them for you. And what comes out of that for you? Yeah. Like it's, I think just spend way more time on it rather than kind of like cherry picking, like, look, that study confirms what I just thought, or that study is in line with what I have been taught. Take the time to do the research across many different studies and bring the
Mm.
information together and then see what comes out of it. And of course, like it's incredibly time consuming, but I think it's totally worth it. And I actually feel like it's the only way. Like we can't just pick one published study and
Mm.
call it the study that is in line with um with what we are convinced about.
I think that's powerful. What I'm hearing there is you're saying when you're doing scientific study on a plant, to not just look at clinical trials, but to also look at how it works in its native environment, about its ecological niche, about the biochemistry, about the botany of that plant, understand it from many different scientific angles. Don't just reduce it to some clinical trials. And what also came to my mind there is how easy, especially now with AI, it's so easy for me to be like, oh, give me 5 studies about lemon balm and anxiety. I don't actually get a broad spectrum of what the results were. I'm kind of already prompting it to give me what I want, because AI is designed like that. Even when I'm on PubMed and I say lemon balm anxiety, I'm already, rather than just having a broad search of like Melissa officinalis and seeing what are the studies that are emerging, and just reading, all right, I'm going to read all the studies that happened in the last 10 years, that would actually give me a clearer sense of what's emerging in the research, rather than just looking at the 3 studies that say that lemon balm's good for anxiety, right?
Yeah, I agree. And also to be completely fair, like have I done that? Have I read 100 studies on lemon balm? No. Have I sat with lemon balm for 2 years meditating with the plant? No. So it's also like a bit of an extreme here. Obviously, I just wanted to draw the parallel that we can also put a lot of efforts in the scientific investigation or
Mm.
research of the plant, as much as we are encouraged to put into embodied investigation, say, of plant medicine.
Definitely how much I encourage people to do embodied investigation, because, as well, a lot of people don't do that. People just get 5 herbal medicine textbooks that are generally summaries of summaries of summaries. Like someone's writing a textbook and they're looking at 10 other textbooks and summarizing that information. There's not a lot of original data in that. And even if you read 5 great textbooks, that's not enough to know a plant. That we need to go find it where it's growing, look at how it's growing, look at what insects are there with it, pick up the lemon balm, chew it up, and rub it on your skin. Like we need to be bringing our direct scientific capacity, our sensory scientific capacity, as well as a capacity to do research, engage with institutionalized science.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and of course, conclusion of this is that probably throughout your lifetime you will then know about 3 plants because you can't know 50 if you are going to be deep diving into them so much.
Mm. Yeah, we might end up with herbalists specializing in handfuls of plants, which actually some of the stories about this Celtic tradition of the banshees, that families would work with one plant, and they would become an expert of one plant that would be passed on through the generations, the wisdom of that herb. And that's just an amazing amount of specificity and plant relationship, compared to now most herbalists finish their degree and they shallowly know 100 plants, right? We don't need 100 plants.
That's beautiful, and actually comes or then brings for me like another question of then surely like when families then there was one family that knew one plant in depth, surely they were collaborating with other families who knew another plant in depth, right? And
Surely.
they were kind of like created this whole network of knowledge, which is something that is again missing, right? And we have been already discussing that and touching up on that in the Western medicine, how again, you will have a liver specialist not talking to the kidney specialist, which is ridiculous because it's beautiful. Yes, go for it. Have all that knowledge about liver, but please talk to your mate from the kidney department, right? And have a chat over coffee, right? Don't hang out just at liver conferences. Go to kidney conference too.
Especially if you're the same patient, right? At least collaborate on your
Absolutely.
patient.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Mm.
Actually, if I was to say like one thing is like really encourage everyone to keep curious. I think curiosity is just an amazing thing, and keep your mind open and investigate and ask the questions. Don't blindly trust either institution. Just do your own research, whether it's diving into scientific body of literature or whether it is sitting with a plant and meditating in its presence, or going down the embodied experience of it with trying to make medicine out of it and using it both on the skin and internally. Just, yeah, be curious, um, be objective, which is obviously incredibly difficult. I can't do that. But yeah, just I think be open minded. I think that's really very powerful.
I think that's some really beautiful advice. Thanks, Kaya. And there was something that I was really hearing that you were saying is around just to be careful not to conflate science with kind of the capitalist globalized storm that we're in, and to understand that science as a method of study and an honoring of curiosity and rigor is something to be celebrated, and that we can recognize the limitations of science, and that science on its own is not enough, but that we are not to blame all of these problems that are really kind of political problems on science as a method. And to maybe as well, what I'm taking away from this is to be really wary of to be really wary of the way that I cherry pick science and use it when it serves me and when it doesn't. Because really, what I'm doing there is I'm buying into this myth that only science gives me authority, and so I just whack a study in something I'm saying. It makes people trust me more. That's kind of furthering the problems of science rather than supporting a kind of wise and healthy science.
Yeah, I agree. And also maybe one more thing that I will say is that, good science takes time. That's why Edwin Land took 20 years to develop a Polaroid, and he actually did lots of other things as well. But it takes time. And as we were just saying, like, yeah, sit down with like 70 studies and reading that takes a really long time. And we are not even talking about like starting to interpret it. So yeah, good science takes time, and if it's done too quickly, or if we come to a conclusion too quickly, then it's probably not right or not objective, not researched enough.
Mm. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I immensely enjoyed the chat, and I hope it's immensely interesting for the listeners as well. Thank you for listening all the
It
way to here.
it's a beautiful balancing point because I think that there's a lot of conversations on this segment where we talk about the dangers of science and the downside of rationalism. And there is also, we don't want to put that leg in a cast, as you so beautifully drew a picture for us, to also, be interested in the betterment of science as well.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you for summarizing it, and yeah, thank you for the chat. It was really great.
Awesome. Thank you.